Very well. So I'll give you a summary of a number of things we will do today. So this is our public finance and taxation. So this is what we call Nifty. And we had already commenced discussion on public finance, taxation. So we're still looking at taxation. And I'll look at a number of concepts today. Just following up from wherever we had left. I'd started discussing something called tax shifting. We'll finish that. We had already explained what tax shifting is, and we said it's the transfer of the burden of tax to somebody else, right? So it happens a lot with indirect taxes. Remember, our definition of an indirect tax is where the impact and the incidence, the burden of tax are on two different people. So the concept is called tax shifting. So a tax is imposed on person A, but it is transferred to person B. Tax shifting takes place through revising of price, revision of price. So if price is revised upwards, then you call that forward tax shifting, because it's the consumer who will bear the burden of tax. If tax cannot be shifted forward, there are some cases where it might not be possible, especially where the demand of a commodity is elastic. So commodities with elastic demand are those that have substitutes. So they compete for market share. So it will not be in the interest of the producer to increase price. So that means there'll be backward shifting. And we said backward shifting of a tax occurs where a producer negotiates with the suppliers of factors of production, like suppliers of labor, suppliers of raw materials, suppliers of inputs. So if they accept lower prices, then the tax would have been shifted backwards. I think preliminary, earlier we had discussed that. Yeah, I'm already busy. All right. So you can record if you wish. So we discussed that. So what I'll discuss today on tax shifting are simply the factors. The factors that influence tax shifting is a very common question you'll get in tax theory. But let me summarize other concepts I'm going to discuss in this lesson. Hopefully, I'm also going to discuss a concept called taxable capacity. We'll get to see what this is, what taxable capacity is all about. And then we'll be able to discuss budgetary and fiscal policy. And hopefully, I'll also introduce the concept of residence. Concept of residence in taxation. So that's the plan. I hope to finish all this today, so that when we meet on Sunday, then I start on a new topic, taxation of employment income. So we'll start employment income, but to give room for employment income, I have to discuss this concept. So for tax shifting, I was only going to discuss factors. So we'll start with factors that influence tax shifting. So these are very common examination questions, but your examiner will be very kind to you. He'll give you the number of factors you must explain. So most likely he'll tell you, explain like 5 factors that influence tax shifting, 5 factors or so or explain probably 4 factors, whatever number. Usually it's 4 or 5. Then you'll give this factor. So the first factor I want to explain, and I think I've already mentioned that in the previous class, is called elasticities of demand and supply. This is the first factor. So elasticity from the economics is simply the response, the responsiveness of demand. If you start with the elasticity of demand, the responsiveness of demand to changes in price. So you can say a commodity has elastic demand if it is very sensitive to price changes. Another commodity could have inelastic demand if, for example, it's not very sensitive to price changes. So it means for a commodity with inelastic demand, it is possible to have forward shifting of tax. The producer can revise the price upwards. Examples of commodities like those are beer or whiskey or wines and spirits. And you'll agree with me that every budget, the government increases the excise duty on production of beer or cigarettes. It means the prices have never gone down. Every year, the prices keep going up and up, but you'll never see beer takers or cigarette smokers demonstrating in the streets because of price increases, because the demand is inelastic. These products are kind of addictive. So even if prices increased because of taxes, consumers will continue taking them. So there's a question here from Jose. Jose is asking, I've just joined today. Notes, please. Probably those who are there from the beginning can reshare the note. The notes are already in the WhatsApp group. So Jose, I'm requesting the class to share again the notes so that you can have access to them. But if they don't, then you can send your question again to me. Or even if you share in the group that nobody has shared the notes again, I will reshare. But I think the class will kindly do that for the sake of our brother Jose, so that he can also have the notes. So I'm just reviewing what you already have. You already have the notes. So I was talking about elasticity. If the demand is inelastic, like beer or cigarettes, if excise duty is increased on manufacture of beer or cigarettes, the producers like KBL, Kenya Breweries Limited, or Keroche, or the cigarette makers simply revise the price upwards. They don't even worry. Yeah? So consumers will pay more. The tax will have been shifted forward. Now, there are commodities whose demand is elastic, meaning they have substitute goods. Examples are many, like toothpaste, like soap, because there are many alternatives, even cooking oil. So for those, the producers are very careful with their pricing, and even the government is careful. It's rare that the government will target those goods. The goods usually targeted for high amounts of tax are goods with inelastic demand, like petroleum products, like fuel. I don't know whether you knew this, but probably you'll be surprised, or you already knew, 1 liter of super petrol or diesel has 9 taxes. The government maximizes taxes on fuel. So when politicians argue that they probably will do something about the price of fuel, they know they are lying, because that's the government's cash cow. So that's the source of the main revenue source of the government. They cannot drop that, no matter what. There are 9 whole taxes on 1 liter. So when you buy 1 liter of fuel, you're paying 9 taxes. Why? Because fuel has inelastic demand. You cannot stop using fuel. It's used for transportation, it's used for, those who are in service industry, even in manufacturing. There are machines that, generators and so on, that will need fuel. Even power is produced using fuel and so on. So that's as far as demand is concerned. How about supply? The same thing. If supply is inelastic, like farm products, then farmers cannot pass taxes to their consumers. Inelastic supply means, for example, if you're a farmer and you brought tomatoes to the market, they are perishing. If the price is not right, you cannot return them home. It's better, even in the evening, you reduce price so that you sell off your stock, rather than you go home with it and it's all ruined. So those suppliers of things like milk, flowers, fruits, chicken, you take the price that the market offers, and they might not pass any increases to the consumer because the supply is inelastic. But then there are other producers whose supply is elastic, like producers of goods that can be stored, like cement, cement or other manufactured goods. If the price is not right, they simply withdraw them from the market, and store them. They'll sell when the price is right. So that's our first factor, elasticity of demand and supply. Then there's another factor called time available for adjustment. Time available for adjustment. So what this factor means, usually it's even if the price of a commodity increases, the consumer is likely to adjust more in the long run than in the short run. An example, if say the price of meat goes up, okay, it's unlikely that customers will just drastically at once stop consumption of meat, but with time they will adjust. In the short run, they'll continue buying, even with the high increase in price, but as time goes by, they will adjust and start buying alternative products, especially if you have a big family and you may no longer afford it. So time is an important factor as far as elasticity is concerned. The response, the change in demand will be experienced more in the long run than in the short run. So time available for adjustment is an important factor. You can mention to the examiner in case he's asking for factors that influence elasticity of demand. In the long run, there is more change. Then there is government policy. Government policy on pricing. Government policy on pricing. Now, government policy means they are, okay, from your economics. I know it's a long time when you did economics, but our kind of economy, even though it's a mixed economy, you can say it is liberalized. Liberalized means we have left, or the government has left prices to market forces, demand and supply. So right now, the government, hopefully, if my perception of it is correct, by building more affordable houses, they are hoping to increase the supply and therefore increase affordability. The prices probably will go down if there are many housing units available, if that's what the government has in mind. And because of the increased supply, many more people will get affordable housing, So government policy. So I was trying to explain that government does not fix prices. Those are some 2 decades ago when we were at a stage where the government was more controlling more, was more dominant in the market. So there will be a price list. We are no longer there. But there are a few areas where the government still fixes prices, like the price of fuel. There's a regulatory body called Energy and Petroleum Regulatory Authority, EPRA. So EPRA revises the price of fuel every month, I think. Every month, they produce a schedule for prices of super petrol, diesel, kerosene, 1 liter in Mombasa, in Nairobi, in Eldoret, and so on. So that's a case of policy, government policy. So if the government policy has already set a price at a certain amount, then it means there will be no tax shifting. The producer will have to bear the burden of tax because he cannot transfer the burden of tax to the consumer because the prices are fixed. So government policy is an important factor as far as tax shifting is concerned. So on few occasions, like fuel, or sometimes when the government sometimes wants to support farmers, and the government could fix the price of coffee per kilo in the coffee auctions in the interest of the farmer, so that the farmer does not lose. And in such circumstances, the farmer is very grateful to the government. So in case of price fixing, the argument is, in case prices have already been fixed by the government, then there is no room for shifting of taxes by the producer. So the producer will bear the burden of tax. The next factor is called geographical location. Geographical location. Geographical location. So if taxes are only imposed on a certain location, then it's possible for the consumer to avoid them altogether. So the burden will remain with the producer. So if the market is competitive, it will not take long for the consumer to realize that only in location A they charge taxes. So they'll avoid that market and buy from location B where there are no taxes. So we're saying if taxes are only being levied on certain geographical location, you can avoid, the consumer can avoid them. So it means the taxes will not be shifted to the consumer. The consumer will buy goods in locations where that tax does not exist. Now, do I have an example? Probably. Now, this might apply to our county governments. So the county governments don't, they levy different taxes depending. Just this week, it was very interesting to see some counties have really increased their revenues by 200%, by 120%, by, they've been aggressive within the counties. I mentioned from the beginning that counties don't levy taxes. All taxes are levied by the national government, by the law and constitution. That's where, under public finance, we'll be talking about the concept of sharing of revenue, the process of sharing of revenue, because it is the national government that by law has the mandate to collect taxes, so they have to share the revenue with the counties. But that said, the counties must also collect their, what we call, own source revenue. Own source revenue. So I was going to give an example and say, if some counties levy certain taxes which are not in certain counties, then it's easy to avoid them by simply, for example, there are some counties that charge levies for any goods transported through them. Nairobi County had a tax on farm products, like those who bring in grain. Most millers are in Nairobi, probably you're aware, in industrial area. Milling means, turning the maize now into flour. The biggest millers are in Nairobi. But you see, grain does not grow in Nairobi. So our bread baskets are in Uasin Gishu, Kitale, Rift Valley, those areas. So it's implied that there must be transportation. So Nairobi was charging, was leaving any goods coming into Nairobi, even if it's in transit to that, go down to it, it's going to be milled. So a farmer could avoid that and say, no, I cannot go to Nairobi to have my maize milled there. So they can look for millers in a neighboring county that is not as aggressive as Nairobi to reduce their cost and so on. So geographical location is a factor as far as tax shifting is concerned. And then we have the nature of tax. Nature of tax. Nature of tax. So remember, so far in our classifications, we did certain types of taxes. We talked about a direct tax, where both the impact and the incidence is on the same person. Examples, income tax, unemployment income. You cannot transfer the burden. The burden is borne by the employee. So the same point it is imposed is the same place where payment is. So we have direct taxes like income tax, corporation tax, and so on. Then we have indirect taxes like excise duty imposed on producers of manufactured goods in the country. So excise duty is an indirect tax because it can be transferred. You can shift it. Like you impose excise duty on production of cigarettes, BAT will revise prices of cigarettes upwards. You impose VAT and excise duty on importation of whiskey, though the importers will raise the product so they can transfer. So we're saying the nature of tax determines shifting. If it's a direct tax, then it cannot be shifted whatsoever. The person on whom it is imposed is the same person who will pay. But if it's an indirect tax, there's room for transfer to another person. So if you impose excise duty on manufacture of, say, on manufacture of cigarettes or beer, it will be transferred to the consumer. So the government will be able to meet its objective. It will raise more revenue. At the same time, it will have increased the prices of some of these goods. We did that on the purposes of taxation to make it unaffordable to a number of people so that their health could be protected. I must have mentioned, but this is probability. You cannot say for certain. If you take cigarettes, there's a high chance you could contract cancer, probability. There are others who even take cigarettes the whole of their lives and they don't contract. There are others who get it from secondary smoking. So if you have somebody who's always smoking around you, is a chain smoker, you might get cancer as a result of that, you know. So because there is that high chance, the government believes by imposing higher excise duty on production of beer and cigarettes, it will probably reduce consumption. So we are saying nature of tax. Direct taxes cannot be shifted whatsoever. Indirect taxes can be transferred to consumer. Finally, the rate of tax. The rate of tax. So if the rate of tax is high, then tax shifting can occur either forward by revising the price upwards or backwards if the rate is high. But if the rate of tax is low, then most likely the producer, because he wants to be competitive, might decide to absorb the tax. I'll give you an example. In 2013, probably that's very long ago, but this will help you understand. In 2013, the government introduced excise duty on airtime for the first time. And the rate that time was 5%. Over the years, it has increased. I think right now it's 20%. But the first year when it was introduced, I believe was 2013, the rate of 5% on airtime, both Airtel then and Safaricom reasoned that it was not strategic for them to pass that increase to the consumer for purposes of being competitive. But more importantly, they felt that 5% was low and they felt they could absorb, they could take care of that, you know? And so both of them bought space in the newspaper then, Daily Nation, and they said each one was blowing their trumpet, but it was just marketing. They were saying, look, we really care about the consumer. The government has just increased the rate of excise duty by 5%, increasing our cost of production, but we've maintained our prices. Somebody has not muted themselves. Ni nani huyo? Kuna mtu hajajimute. Please mute yourself. So they bought space, and each one of them, Safaricom and Airtel, was saying, look, we really care. We are very sensitive to our consumers because even though our cost of production has increased, we've maintained our prices for the interest of the consumer. That could as well have been true. But what is also true is that probably they had meetings with them, you know, in their own companies, and they did not see why they should, you know, lose market share because of a rate of 5% at the time. But these days, Safaricom is very, very sensitive. If, like, I think last budget or the other year, they introduced increased excise duty on M-Pesa services. They revised their prices immediately. Immediately. They did not even wait. The next day, they had a new list of prices. But our factor here is simply that the rate of tax will determine the decision by the producer. If the rate of tax is high, the producer will be forced to revise the prices and probably bear part of it, share costs of the tax. If the rate of tax is low, if in some cases, the producer might just decide, I don't want to lose market share, so I'll keep prices the way they are. So those are the factors that influence tax shifting. Oh, there's one I left out called nature of markets. Let me explain this and we're done. Nature of markets. Nature of markets. Again, from your economics, a market is not really a physical place, but an arrangement. You know, it could be a physical place like Wakulima Market, but it also could be an arrangement where the buyer and the seller can express their interests. So a market could be on the phone, could be on computer, but we categorize markets based on competition. I'll only give 2 examples here. It will help us understand about how it influences elasticity. So the first market I'm going to look at is competitive market. Competitive. So in a competitive market, the assumption or what is expected is that there is a large number of buyers and a large number of sellers. Now that's important because there's a large number of buyers and sellers, none of them can influence the market price. For example, the seller cannot withhold his commodity in the hope that the price will go up because there are many other sellers. The buyer can also not insist on being given a certain price to buy because there are many other buyers who are willing to buy. Now, because of there being a large number of buyers and sellers, and there's also freedom of entry and exit from the market, it means both the buyer and seller cannot influence the market price. You know, they have no say. So it's the market that fixes the market price. In a case like that, it is the producer who will bear the tax. The producers will bear the tax because they have no control on the price. The market is very competitive. and there are many other producers ready to supply. If you give room, you lose your market share. So in a market like that, the producer will bear the tax burden. He cannot shift it to the consumer. Then another extreme market, probably, we can look at is called monopoly. So a monopoly market is a market where there's only one producer of a commodity, like KPLC is the only one. It's not the only one that produces power, but it's the only one that the law, for the moment, allows to sell to the consumers the power. So even if other producers generate power through solar, geothermal, or any other means, they have to sell it to Kenya Power so that Kenya Power can sell it directly to the consumer. So in that sense, you can say the consumer is the only seller of electricity in the market. In that sense, it means it's a monopoly. So for a monopoly, it means every time there's a tax, it will pass the whole tax to the consumer. Probably that's the reason why you've had a lot of complaints about power in this country, because there are two things I've noticed they do. They can quietly reduce the units you get. So that's an increase in price, even though in a very clever way. So if 1,000, for example, was giving you 80 units, that was many years ago, they can still say they'll sell you units at 1,000 bob, but reduce it gradually. It went down to 70. These days, I think you get only 50 something. That's a very indirect way of increasing the rate of power. And they also have their own arguments. They'll say the cost of production, the cost of fuel, and so on and so forth, and so on. So we are saying, in case you are the only producer, then you can manage to shift the whole tax burden to the buyer, and so on. So that's the concept of tax shifting. Anybody with a question? So the examiner asks you to explain the factors that influence tax shifting. Those are the factors. You can read more in the notes. So that's tax shifting done. Now I introduce the next concept called taxable capacity. Taxable capacity. The concept of taxable capacity. So taxable capacity is the maximum amount of tax the government can obtain from a country, from the citizens, or even from an individual. Get the maximum tax without causing pain or undesirable effects. So you should be asking yourself, what is the maximum tax the government can get from you without causing you negative or undesirable effects? That's taxable capacity. So there are two concepts of taxable capacity. There is a concept called relative taxable capacity. And there's another concept called absolute. So absolute taxable capacity means if you want to tax somebody to the last coin, absolutely. It means you have to do some homework. The homework will be determine his determine his circumstances. Like, where does he work? What is his industry? What is the size of his family? Okay, determine that. Also, take into consideration the economic conditions, economic environment. In other words, the government, we are assuming the government has the ability to do this. In Kenya, we are around 50 million. The truth is, the Kenya government does not have the capacity to monitor, like all households in Kenya. I know the 50 million, some of them may not be people working. That includes students, babies, older people who have left work, and so on. But now, if you consider those who are in employment currently, it means the government should have the ability through your PIN numbers, through whatever other means, the government should have the capacity to determine exactly the conditions of each individual. What conditions are you working in? Are you being paid weekly? Kama when in Mjengo, are you in the matatu industry, being paid daily, and they earn a lot of money every day? So once the exact circumstances of a taxpayer have been determined, then they will be taxed to the last coin. Yeah? So for example, you determine somebody's family, how many children do they have, are they married, are they not married, what's the economic environment, like inflation, how difficult is the economy right now? Then decide on the amount to tax a person based on whatever is left after you've already removed what he needs for his personal needs. Then theoretically, that would be absolute taxable capacity. Just the way I've described it, it's more theoretical than practical. Probably it can work in Europe or in the US or in Germany, wherever, probably because they have the means to determine. They have a lot of ways because there they monitor even those who are working. They know exactly where you're working and so on. But even that said, there are many immigrants who Trump is now threatening to shall I say, to deport en masse. If he's elected, he's going to deport en masse. There are many immigrants from Kenya, Nigeria, other countries who are there but illegally. You know, there are many. So even in a country with technology like Europe or US, it's still possible to sneak in and you'll be there and they don't have your data. Okay, so the argument I'm trying to make is absolute taxable capacity may not be very practical. It could be an ideal situation. What is more common is relative taxable capacity, where the government just decides on relatively or comparing what would be the basic level of taxing people so that there is equity, there is fairness, no? Like what should be the minimum salary? Currently is 24,000 a month. So if you earn 24 and above, then you'll be taxed and so on. And then they try as much as possible to make sure people on the same income level pay the same tax. Those who are higher pay more tax and so on. That's called relative taxable capacity. Now that is more common. I try to explain taxable capacity using blood transfusion. I'm sure some of you have been involved in giving blood, maybe to a relative, to a friend who was in hospital, and so on. If you have, or if you haven't, probably you know this, that to give blood, there's a quantity you give. I think it's 1 pint. If they take more than that, it will be undesirable. So even tax should be looked at like that. So there's been a lot of debate in Kenya. Are we being overtaxed? What I didn't hear people discussing was this aspect of taxable capacity. Probably people should start making a point of doing some research and seeing what is our taxable capacity and have we exceeded it? Have we given more than we should? Because if you give more blood than 1 pint, then you'll be hospitalized. You might not leave the bed. So usually, for those of you who have donated, they only take 1 pint. So if your patient needs more than one, then you have to bring in more people and so on. So taxable capacity is also like that. If you overtax people, you still remember principle of economy, then it will not be good for the economy because people will not be able to save and invest. Then we cannot build capital as a country. Capital is built out of savings. So that's what we call taxable capacity. Now, taxable capacity also has factors that influence it. And usually the examiner can ask you about those factors. So factors that influence taxable capacity. That influence taxable capacity. The first factor is called number of inhabitants. In a country. Now, Kenya has an estimated 50 million people. Is Kenya the biggest population in East Africa? No. Kenya is not the biggest. I think the most populous country in East Africa must be Tanzania. Tanzania must be going towards 60 million. But at the same time, we have countries with very few people, like Rwanda. You can Google some of this data to confirm. Rwanda, I think, has a very small population of around 15 million. So what's this argument about numbers? Numbers have an influence on how much revenue the government can collect. In countries that have bigger numbers, the taxable capacity is higher. Take Nigeria, for example. Nigeria is the most populous country in Africa, and it has a very big economy. It's one of the biggest economies in Africa. I think the biggest should be South Africa and then Nigeria, because Nigeria has 200 million plus. So the population of Nigeria can be compared with the population of the whole of the USA, the whole of the US. Currently, I think they have a population of around 300 million. I'm not sure Nigeria has reached 300 million, but Nigeria must be over 200. A small country, compared with 50 states of USA. But USA has around 300 million. Nigeria could be having slightly above 200. Slightly above 200 million. So we are saying the bigger the population, the higher the taxable capacity of a country. Of course, there are other factors that will determine how much tax a country can produce, like the economy and so on. But the population is a very good factor or a very good indicator. Another factor for taxable capacity could be methods. Methods used in collection of taxes. This year, Gen Zs led this country in demonstrating to demand accountability. And the result of that was the removal. The result of that was the removal of Finance Act 2024-2025 was removed. Now, the Finance Act was going to introduce additional taxes, like a tax on ownership of motor vehicle. I think they were supposed to pay, 15% of the value of the motor vehicle and other taxes. At some point, there was even taxes that were rumored that were going to be introduced on bread. Kenya would have made history. Kenya would have made history as the most insensitive country because bread is considered to be a basic. a necessity for the poor. Why? Because a family of four, maybe a family of four, the only breakfast they can think about is bread. Because what is the alternative? If you try to buy, are they called arrowroots? Ndoma, or even sweet potatoes, you'll find they are more expensive. Like a loaf of bread is 55 or 60 or 50. Now that can serve a family of four. Now, if they bought ndoma of 50 shillings, it will not. In other words, in Kenya, we don't have options. So a good tax policy would try to avoid certain commodities, just in trying to support those who are not of very high economic groups, but you want some economic stability, because you can see those demonstrations caused instability. We didn't know the end game. It could have even resulted in an uprising like what has happened in Sri Lanka and other countries that has totally resulted in a coup and so on. So a government would want to have stability, political stability. And to have political stability, you try to keep people peaceful by not angering them. And that leads me to methods of collection of taxes. Now, in East Africa, within East Africa, Kenya collects the highest taxes, but the government wants more every budget. In this budget, I think KRA had been given a target of about 2.8 trillion shillings. So there are additional taxes to try and raise that. So, well, it explains why methods are important. Methods used in collection of tax may result in more revenue or even less revenue, but methods are important. For example, if you talk about methods in Kenya, and we did that in the previous introductory topic, in Kenya we have a number of taxes. Then we also have introduced technology like iTax, eTIMS, there's iTax, there's eTIMS. All these are to ensure, for example, iTax, when it was introduced, it has a database. So it gives a lot of information about taxpayers. So it makes it easier for KRA than before to track down those who are involved in tax evasion. So if you keep filing nil returns, the database has a memory. There's an end game to it. You cannot file nil returns for 10 years. KRA will begin asking you questions and so on. So iTax has, made tax collection more efficient and even widened the scope of tax and increased the possibilities of collecting more revenue. The same to eTIMS, which is intended to streamline, especially VAT, to ensure everybody is able to, because all transactions are now will be captured by KRA directly. So you cannot just get input tax refund if it cannot be evidenced by eTIMS and so on. So we're saying method is important. It will influence the capacity. So this country called Kenya has been increasing revenue from 2003, when Kibaki took over, until now. The revenue has gone up almost 10 times. Part of the reason might not necessarily be, okay, there are new taxes that have been introduced, but also taxes have been streamlined and methods of collection. can be a factor that increases taxable capacity. Then purposes of taxation, purpose. And this is a very legit factor because people would want to know, you have very big targets of collection of revenue. What do you want to do with this revenue? Or what have you done with this revenue? These questions are not just being asked in Kenya, they're being asked globally. In the US now, they're in campaigns. The elections are coming in November. So there are two strong parties. I'm sure you know about that. You know about Republicans, and their candidate is called Donald Trump. And there are Democrats, and their candidate is a lady, the current vice president called Kamala Harris. Now there, the debate, okay, they are not very different from us. Like you can see a lot of supporters of Trump might not even want to reason. A lot of them are people who feel very, very strongly that their country is being taken over by people who are not pure whites. So they feel if they support Trump, Trump will deport people and make America great again, MAGA, and so on. But that brings us to the purposes of taxation. So what Americans now in every state are questioning, what plans does each candidate have? Or what plans does each party have? So if you hear about the Democrats, they have issues they are championing. And Republicans, there's argument they are strong on the economy. They're saying, look, we are going to reduce taxes for corporates so that they can increase jobs and so on. But the Democrats are saying, look at their objective. They want to reduce taxes for big corporations and forget about the small person. We are more concerned about the middle income person. So Kamala will tell you, I grew up as part of the middle class. Probably Trump does not know. And I grew up with parents that were working hard to put food on the table. So that would be my priority. I want to assist young people who are just starting work to get homes by providing mortgage and so on. So what is the purpose of taxation? So if the purpose of taxation, even in Kenya, is to provide public goods, part of the reasons I believe why Kenya Kwanza, the current regime, was able to influence some voters to come on their side, they had a lot of promises. They're saying we are going to collect revenue and we're going to do a list of things. So whether they fulfill those promises, the jury is out there. So it's up to the citizens to review that. In the next election round, we'll tell whether Kenya Kwanza did a good job with what they collected as tax or not. It's the taxpayer or it's the mwananchi to decide that. But purposes of taxation will determine in this sense. If the government spends a big amount of revenue in building infrastructure, fixing roads, electricity, water, schools, providing health facilities and so on, and people can see that, it will increase taxable capacity. However, if a lot of people discern or feel that the government is not doing much in as far as providing goods and services, or even, using the tax revenue well. So you'll hear debates like, why would, for example, the president keep flying, and incurring huge tax bills on flights? I remember one particular flight that brought a lot of debate was his trip to the US that cost 98 million, if I remember correctly. One way was 98 million, so two way was around 200 million. And there was uproar, the whole country. people are asking, okay, it's good to reach the US in a grand style, but you're coming from a developing country called Kenya. Resources probably had other priority places. You could have used those millions to provide medication for babies that are just being born, for maybe vaccines and so on. So there are critical needs in the country and so on. So the purposes will determine. People would engage in tax evasion if they feel that the tax revenue is not being used properly, or where in countries like, which country in Europe? There's a country in Europe, I think it is Sweden, you can Google, where taxpayers, the government has made it a policy to provide a lot of goods. Like there's free education up to university level. The government takes care of medical bills. I think it's one of the few countries where medical, there's the government facilitates, or the government has a program even to pay for medical. Most countries don't do that. Most countries don't do that. It has been an argument even in the US. The US, they have what they call Obamacare, where the cost of prescription drugs have come down. The government negotiates directly with pharmaceutical companies and does that. So if the government does that, then taxable capacity will increase. So purposes of taxation, then you have psychology of the taxpayer, psychology. Psychology of the taxpayer. Psychology means your mindset. And mindsets, and these are difficult subjects because people are not the same. People are very different. And even people from the same family may disagree. The father and the son, the father and the daughters, the mother, people disagree. Psychology, what's your perception? We don't perceive things the same way. And perception will depend on many things. The information you have, the experiences you had will, your environment will make you form certain perceptions. And once you have that mindset and you believe, for example, if you have a negative perception about the current leadership, then that will also influence how you respond to payment of tax. Psychology, your perceptions, and all of us have perceptions. So if I feel it is right to pay taxes, and I'm so convinced, then I'll pay regardless of which government is there. But if I perceive that my tax is being wasted, I feel this is a government that doesn't care for any perception. So if we had positive perceptions about this government, we would support by increasing the level of taxes. So that's psychology, perception. Then there is the matter of economy, economic stability. So if the country is undergoing economic challenges, meaning there is reduced employment, there's unemployment, and this happens across the world. There are certain states, even in the US, where there are certain industries going, and those industries one day closed shop, and the natives of those places were left with nothing. There are companies in Kenya also that have closed, and those who had employment in those countries all went home. Now, I want you to pay attention, even in this estate you live, you'll notice there are many more Kenyans that try to survive by engaging in one business or another because there are very few formal employment opportunities. So you'll find people making chapatis, you'll find people making madondo, people engage in all sorts of things. And that brings us to this point, economic stability. Do we have jobs? So when the economy is performing well and there is employment, taxable capacity goes up because more people can contribute. But when there are challenges, the worst challenge in Europe was in 1930. They called it the Great Depression. I even mentioned to you that in 1 month, the inflation in Germany, inflation refers to the cost of living, rose to 300%. They measure inflation by looking at the changes in prices of certain basket of goods, like bread, like cooking oil, soap, toothpaste. So if they monitor the prices of things from 1 month to another, then they can tell you the percentages by which the cost of living has increased, because you're paying more for the same goods you used to buy the other month at a certain price. This month you're buying at a different price. All these things bring about economic instability. So when the economy is not stable and productivity has gone down, people are unemployed, so consumption has also gone down. Consumption means buying behavior. So there are certain locations, when you make observations in the morning, lots of people wake up very early and they walk. So that's reduction in consumption. Like if you operate transport business in those locations, then you don't have a lot of business. So you'll see a lot of people on the road walking to industrial area from Mathare, from Kayole, from Kibera, they walk. Because probably what they make may not sufficiently cater for their transport. Probably their main budget is food at home and their children, feeding and probably paying rent. So they have priorities, and transport may not be one of them. So that directly affects an economy. If you don't have a high demand for transport services, then that affects the transport industry. It's a domino effect. The demand for goods and services also reduces. So it means companies have to retrench people because people are not really buying a lot of goods. So in a case like that, even taxable capacity reduces. But when there's boom and there's heightened economic activity, more tax revenue is collected. That's what we are talking about. The last factor is called inflation. So inflation could be because of costs. So it's called cost push inflation, where the cost of production have increased. And so the producers have to increase prices of goods. So goods become more expensive, costs. Like in Kenya now, the producers will complain about the cost of power, the cost of fuel, taxes, and so on. And when it becomes very difficult, then they have to increase their prices. Then the rates of inflation will go up. Now, that will reduce the value of money. So if the value of money is reduced, then taxable capacity also is reduced and so on. So that is the concept of taxable capacity. Who has a question on taxable capacity? Anyone? Anyone? Okay, there's no question on taxable capacity. You can read more in the notes. Then I want to look at the last concept here. It's not actually the last. There's budgetary and fiscal policy. Budgetary and fiscal policy. So there's a concept here called budgetary and fiscal policy. There are two policies here. Let me start with budgetary policy. So budgetary policy, anytime you see the word policy, policy refers to measures. So these are measures designed by the National Treasury. Maybe not the National Treasury, because the budget is not just designed by the National Treasury. The National Treasury will coordinate the preparation of the national budget, the last one of which was thrown out because of demonstration by Generation Z. But budget making usually begins in August. Like the budget cycle for next year has already started. We'll be discussing more of that in public finance. Okay, so measures are put in the budget to achieve specific objectives. For example, in the budget, through spending, allocating of money, the government might have a policy to reduce prices in the economy. How is that? The government could say they could subsidize, it's called subsidy. The government would allocate a huge amount of the budget to give fertilizers to farmers, like they usually do, so that instead of buying a 50 kilogram of fertilizer at 6,800, the fertilizer is now bought at 3,800. The 3,000 difference is called a subsidy. That subsidy must be budgeted. Now, because of that, many more farmers can have access to the fertilizer, leading to better yields or better production. So what will better production do? It will bring down the cost of food, the cost of maize flour, and that has been the pride of Kenya Kwanza. They said when they took over, unga was, I think, over 2 kilograms of unga. Cooking flour. But as we speak today, you can get unga at 120, 130, depending on the brand. There are brands that even go at 100, and they are saying the policy was to increase the production, subsidize farmers, encourage farmers by giving them cheaper fertilizers so that they can plow more and produce more, more maize. So if supply increases, then the price per 90 kg of maize goes down, and so does unga. So one of the objectives of budgetary policy is to achieve a desirable price level. Have policies to ensure the prices of goods and services are affordable. That's in the budgetary policy. So these are measures that use the budget as a plan. The government will have planned expenditure. How much will be spent in agriculture and which specific activities in agriculture? How much spending should go to tourism to increase tourism so that different sectors of the economy can contribute to the total output. The total output in a country is called GDP, gross domestic product. So if the government has a target to grow GDP, say, by 5%, now this must be targeted or spread in different sectors. For example, Kenya is mainly an agricultural country. So the government might say, by spending money on fertilizers and supporting farmers, we want agriculture to create jobs and to add to the GDP, the output we're going to produce, say by 20%. And so on. So part of the objectives the examiner can ask you, what are the objectives of budgetary policy? To achieve a desirable price level, prices of goods and services, to achieve a desirable consumption level. Consumption is related to pricing. It means through measures in the budget, things like gas should be made available. For example, the government removed VAT on gas so that it's affordable. I don't know whether at the current prices it's affordable, but achieve desirable consumption level means many homes, many families should be able to afford gas. And it's a deliberate policy because the government doesn't want us to go back to charcoal and wood because that will lead to deforestation. And that would be a shame because the whole world now is trying to fight climate change for survival, Because if climate change is not, if we don't reduce the emissions of certain gases in the atmosphere, then we'll start seeing climatic disasters like floods, heat waves, rain coming from nowhere. In the West, they have storms. Luckily, they have the means to protect human life. If it were in Kenya, a lot of people would die. There are a lot of hurricanes in the US. Hurricane Katrina, there are always hurricanes, each time given names, because of climate change. So you can be asked, what are the objectives of budgetary policy? To achieve desirable price levels, to achieve a desirable consumption level, to achieve a desirable employment level. So budgetary policy is supposed to put spending, like now, this government, theoretically, has been spending on construction. And if you hear them talk about it, most of the president will say, we've created these thousands of jobs in construction, affordable housing. So one of the objectives of budgetary policy is achieve a desirable employment level. So there are affordable houses hopefully being constructed in all counties, in Nairobi, Machakos, Homa Bay, Embu, Meru, everywhere. Now, hopefully, this will not only contribute to our output, GDP, it will also create employment. It will also increase consumption because if you're paid, you can also go and buy goods for your family. It will increase consumption and so on. Another target of any budget is to increase the rate of economic growth. So every year, the government has a target. Politicians will tell you that this economy has to grow by 10% to keep up with the needs for employment. But our economy has never reached 10%. Actually, there's a very quiet neighbor who has quietly been growing the economy by 10% every year. They are not as loud as us. The neighbor is called Ethiopia. Ethiopia, for the last couple of years, you can Google them, it's a very good country. They've been growing the economy by 10%. And their population is even bigger than Kenya. Now, you can see one of the reasons why the clever Safaricom had to move to Ethiopia. Why? It's a bigger market. They have a population of more than 100 million people. It's double the population of Kenya. Then the economy has been doing very well, growing by 10% every year. So people are employed, so people have money to spend on airtime. There's a high rate of consumption, a desirable rate of consumption, and so on. So that's budgetary policy. Anyone with a question on budgetary policy? So it's about the national budget, where the government decides on how to, through national treasury, they budget for the different sectors of the economy to achieve very specific objectives. Very, very specific objectives. So the budget is used as an instrument also to regulate the economy, to help the government maybe to concentrate resources on areas where the government feels they'll optimize development and growth. Then there is fiscal policy, also designed by the National Treasury. So fiscal policy is a combination. It's the combination of public revenue. This is where you have taxes, you have other sources of public revenue, then you have public expenditure, and public debt. So these are instruments at the disposal of the National Treasury. Now, these instruments, combination of them, make up what we call fiscal policy. So policy are measures, for example, if there is inflation, how does Treasury use these instruments to correct that? Taxes will be increased. Then the government will reduce public expenditure. Projects will be reduced in order not to put more money in the economy, because inflation means there's too much money already. So if the government senses that there is too much money in circulation, causing inflation, they increase rates of taxes to reduce the amount of money available to spend by households. It's called disposable income. The government will reduce expenditure on projects. It will plan less projects so that less money can be spent. Then the government will increase the domestic borrowing. How does the government borrow from the domestic market? They'll issue treasury bills, treasury bonds. Those are instruments for borrowing that are issued through the Central Bank of Kenya. And banks will buy those treasury bills. Banks, savings and credit cooperatives, insurance companies, as they buy into government bonds and infrastructure bonds and treasury bills, money will move away from the economy back to the government so as to correct an economy that probably could be inflationary, that could be unstable. The opposite could be true. When the economy is down, there's a depression, and there's less economic activity and unemployment. What does the government do? Reduce taxes so that people can be left with more money. Increase public expenditure. Spend more. That's when you hear the government announcing kazi kwa vijana, kazi mtaani. That time, know that the objective will be to put back more money in the economy. Give work to local people like carpenters to make desks, to make beds for hospitals and so on. The idea is put more money in the economy so that more money can circulate. That time, the government will give back money, will buy the treasury bonds and bills from the market, buy them back so that people can get more money in their pockets. Read more of that in the notes. So that's budgetary policy and fiscal policy. Again, any questions? Very well. Now I will move on to something called residence for tax purposes. In your notes, the concept of residence is on page 139. The concept of residence. So I want to introduce the concept of residence so that on Sunday, I'll begin from taxation of employment income. So the concept of residence. So I'm sure it's not the first time that you're hearing this word called residence, but the meaning definitely will not be the same as the meaning the context in which you've used the concept probably in your normal usage. So in the normal usage, residence means a place. You know, the president's residence is State House, a place where somebody lives. But for tax purposes, residence means different things, totally different. So residence is determined for an individual and a body corporate every year. Why so? Because this term is significant on how you will be taxed. For an individual, residence refers to being physically in Kenya, your physical presence. For a corporate, it might refer to where the company was registered, mainly, and other things. Now, why is this concept important? It is important because it will determine whether your income is taxable in Kenya or not. Are you a resident or you're not? Okay, to determine on whether your income will be taxed here or not. It will also determine the rates we are going to apply, because if in any year you happen to be a resident, then there's a way your income will be taxed, which is different. The rates of tax that will apply to a resident are different from those that will apply to a non-resident. And then if you're an individual, you get a personal relief. A personal relief is an amount that is deducted from your gross tax before you pay tax liability. I think the current personal relief is 2,400 per month or 28,800 per year. If you're an unresident person, you cannot get that. So residence is very important concept for tax, and we determine that every year. It's under Section 2 of the Income Tax Act. So residence could be in relation to a residence in relation to an individual, and B, residence in relation to a body corporate, a body corporate, of course, is a company. So let me first explain what is residence in relation to an individual. So as far as an individual is concerned, residence depends on whether you are physically present in Kenya in any year of income. So how do we define it? So it means that you have a permanent home in Kenya. So an individual is considered to be a resident. Is a resident or is considered to be a resident if three things have happened. A, he has a permanent home in Kenya. And was present. during the year of income. So what do we mean permanent home? Having a permanent home simply means having a place you call home. So there's a person who went to court and they got this interpretation. It was an East African court, those days of East African community, which sat to determine what they mean by a permanent home. And it was decided that it doesn't have to be the house you've built. Okay? It doesn't even have to be a house made of stone. Unajua if you say in Kiswahili umejenga nyumba permanent, people understand that what you have is a permanent house built of concrete in blocks. That's not the meaning here. The meaning here is simply you have a place you call home. It can even be a hotel room if you can afford to stay in a hotel. Then, if you have such a place where you keep your bags, your clothes, your family is found there, then you can say you have a permanent home. So if you have a permanent home and you are also physically present in Kenya, then you're a resident for that year. That's our first definition. So it means even for people that have a place, if they were not physically here in the year, for example, last year was 2023. If they are not there for the whole year, then they are not residents. There's a son of Kenya, probably you've heard of him, called Professor Ngugi wa Thiong'o. Ngugi wa Thiong'o has a home in Limuru. But for over 2 decades, he has lived in the US. The last time I read about him, he was living in California State. He teaches in the university there. And 2 of his sons, a son and a daughter, 2 of his children are also PhD holders like him. Actually, the son is also a professor. I think he also teaches either English or literature, like father, like son. Same to the daughter. At least I've read about those 2. So I was going to explain about Ngugi. Ngugi has a permanent home in Limuru, but last year he was not in Kenya the whole year. Then it means he is not a resident. So if he's not a resident, shortly we are going to see how he's treated differently. Actually, we don't even interfere with him. We don't interfere with him. So if he has rental property, it will be taxed using rates of a non-resident person, which are higher. The rate for a non-resident person is actually 30%. Well, if you're a resident, if you're a local, the rate on rental income, residential rental property is 7.5% per month. But if you're a non-resident, it's 30%. This is what we're talking about. So this is the first definition. You have to have a permanent home, and then you must have been present in the country, even for 1 day, to be a resident. There's a second definition. He has no permanent home in Kenya, but he was present for an aggregate of 183 days or more. During the year of income. So in the second definition, you don't even have a place in Kenya. You come from time to time, and probably you take a hotel room or you go to B&B. No, you live somewhere, right? But if we can collect data and you are present for a minimum of 183 days or more, you still are a resident person, even if you don't have a permanent home. Then there's a last definition, C. Again, he has no permanent home. He has no permanent home in Kenya, but he was present for an average of more than 122 days during the year of income and in each of the 2 preceding years. So C is a very long definition, but this is what it means. Now we get an average. How do you get an average? In mathematics, normally you add the days he was present for each, starting from the year you're using, and then 2 other years previously, 3 years. Get the number of days in this year, last year, and the previous year, add, divide by 3, and get the average. If the average is more than 122, then that person is a resident. So that's how you define the residence of an individual. Now I want to define the residence of a company. Then after that, I will show you why these definitions are important, because I'll show you the difference in taxation of a resident person and a non-resident by giving you examples of income and how we treat them differently. So let me also explain the residence of a company or a body corporate. How do you define it? So the residence of a company. How do you determine that? A body corporate is a company. So for a company, you look at 3 things. So a company is considered to be a resident. If A, it was incorporated in Kenya. So incorporation refers to registration. So we have different laws. If it's a bank, it must have been incorporated under the Banking Act of Kenya. And there are many banks like that, registered under the Banking Act of Kenya. So that's the first condition. Or if it's a company, it's registered under the Companies Act of Kenya, and so on. Then B, its management and control was exercised in Kenya. So the company must have been managed from Kenya during the year of income. So how do we interpret that? Every company is, or there's a board of directors that oversees the functions of a company. So the management works under a board of directors. Every company has a BOD. So we can, it is implied that the court, in deciding where the management and control of a company was exercised, they look at where the board meetings were held. If the board meetings were held in Kenya, then you'd say the management and control was exercised in Kenya, but it becomes interesting with technology. I don't know how the courts can rule or how they can interpret. It was easier before COVID, and now after COVID, people can even have remote meetings. You can have a board without anybody traveling. So some board members could be in South Africa, some other board members could be in Kenya, other board members could be in a different country, yet they're having a board meeting. I think the court will look at the merits of the case and they will decide where the control is being exercised. But control means the management and control is being exercised from Kenya. And thirdly, the CS. The CS or the ministry. So the CS for the National Treasury. And planning. May declare company to be a resident. Do a notice in the Kenya Gazette. And of course, the CS will be doing that in the public interest, not because he has been bribed. He'll do that in the interest of the public. There must be reasons why this international company can justifiably be granted the resident status because they'll enjoy certain privileges. Now I've been able to define residence of an individual and residence of a company. Is there a question? Anybody with a question? Before now, I show you the differences in tax treatment so that you see the importance of this concept is because of the tax treatment. Anybody with a question? So now I look at the significance of residence. So you can see the importance in the different treatment of income. So significance of the concept. So you do this. I'll show you the differences in treatment between a resident and a non-resident. And the first difference I'll give you will relate to an individual. So this will relate to employment income. So if you are a resident, in the way we had defined and explained, then all your employment income must be taxed in Kenya. Even if you derive it from outside this country, it is all taxable in Kenya. Let me give you examples. You may be working for an organization that, like these big auditing firms, Deloitte, Ernst & Young. I've worked with Ernst & Young in Rwanda. But that time, yeah, I would go to Rwanda and stay like for 3 months or 4 months and come back, you know? So if you are that kind of a person, then all that income must be taxed in Kenya. It means you will declare your total income in Kenya and you'll pay tax in Kenya. Why? You're a resident. you're a resident. That's what it means. But remember, you'll also pay tax in the other country. They'll pay you less tax. But that's the principle. There's a way you get relief for double taxation, but that is done in your advanced taxation. We calculate relief, meaning if there's an agreement called a double taxation agreement, then employees don't have to be taxed twice. You'll compare the two taxes in Rwanda, probably, and Kenya, choose whichever of them is the lowest. So once you've calculated the gross tax, Kenyan tax on the total income, you'll relieve him of one of the taxes. The one that is low will be deducted, so that he's only taxed on one. But that's not important. For now, just understand that if you are in employment and you are a resident for that year, all your employment income will be taxed in Kenya. How about if you're non-resident? If you're a non-resident, you only tax employment income that was derived from Kenya. I gave you an example of Professor Ngugi wa Thiong'o. For many years, he's not come back to Kenya because when he comes, it will be in the news. We will know if he has come. Now, because he has not been physically present, he'll be treated as a non-resident. So the employment income he earns in California University in the US cannot be taxed in Kenya because it was derived from outside Kenya and is a non-resident. However, if his house in Limuru was rented and he was collecting rent, it will be taxed in Kenya but at a higher rate because he's a non-resident. Will need tax of 30%. But if he was a resident, he'd be paying 7.5% monthly. So that's one difference between a resident and non-resident. The other difference is about personal relief. The amount of personal relief is 2,400 per month or 28,800 per annum. So personal relief, be more keen when you're try and develop some interests in calculating your own tax at the end of the month. From Sunday, we'll be doing employment income, so you'll be able to calculate your own tax. After calculating the gross tax, if you're a resident, they deduct 2,400 for everybody. It's called a relief. You're being relieved of the tax burden. Now, this relief is only granted to a resident, not a non-resident. If you're a non-resident, even if they use the graduated scale to calculate your tax, you don't get to deduct anything. So there is no relief. You pay the gross. That's another difference. Another difference is on which income. Let me introduce pension. Pension, because we did pension under purposes of taxation. Pension income. If you're a resident person and you retire and they want to pay you pension, there'll be those limits we talked about. If you're paid lump sum, if you're paid in lump sum means one-off payment, then the first 600,000. We discussed this under purposes of taxation will be exempted from tax. They'll only tax what is above that if you're a resident. And then if you're being paid monthly or periodic amounts, then the first 25,000 per month or 300,000 per year will be exempted from tax. If you're a non-resident person, there is no exemption. Everything you get will be taxable. So gross pension is taxable. No exempt limits, the rate is 5%. There's a withholding tax. Withholding. They'll withhold tax. Short for withholding tax is WHT. Withholding tax of 5%. So you can see there'll be differences in tax treatments, and there are many, but want to give some examples here so that you understand why it's so important to determine residence. We determine it every year. There's another income called rent. Rental income. And there are two types of rental income. There's residential, and commercial property. If you are a resident person and you have property that is called residential, then you'll be paying 7.5% of the gross rent if it's residential. 7.5% of the gross rent to KRA. It is called monthly rental income tax regime, MRI. Monthly rental income tax regime. You pay 7.5% monthly, then you file returns every month. Residential property. If it is commercial property means you have offices, you have godowns, you have a shopping mall, you have business premises. Then you'll prepare an income statement. If you're a resident, you'll be allowed from your gross rent, you'll be allowed to deduct your expenses. It is the net that will be taxable if you're a resident. How about if you're a non-resident? It doesn't matter. Whether you have residential property or commercial property, the rate is withholding tax of the gross, 30% of the gross amount. You don't deduct expenses, 30% of the gross. So if Ngugi wa Thiong'o, even though he's a born Kenyan by birth, but because he's not a resident, if his property in Limuru is being rented, we expect from the rental income, he gives KRA 30% of the gross because he's a non-resident. The other income is called royalty income. So royalty is income on intellectual property. Intellectual property is property that is not tangible. When you've written a book, then you get copyrights. Copyrights means any person cannot use copies, cannot extract material from your book without permission. That's what copyright law is about. You're protected. So copyright gives you income. The income is called royalty. Anybody who wants to use your material will pay. Look at our local brothers called the comedians and the Churchill Live. What they earn is royalties out of their creativity. They are paid royalties. That's the kind of income I'm talking about. If you're a resident person and you have royalties, you'll be allowed to deduct your expenses from royalties. Like Churchill Live, probably, if it's a company, they can deduct what they pay the comedians and other expenses, then pay tax on the net. But if you're a non-resident person, you don't even deduct expenses. They want you to pay 20% withholding tax on the gross amount. That is royalty income. Finally, suppose these are companies and not individuals. If you are a resident company, then you're allowed to prepare your P&L account, profit and loss account. You deduct all your expenses, and you only pay tax if there's profit. If there's loss, you carry forward. You don't pay tax. Okay? If there's profit, the corporation tax rate is 30%. Now, at least for that, KRA has changed the rates of tax, and now corporation tax is the same for both residents and non-residents, but it used to be higher for non-residents. It used to be 37.5%, so that international or multinational company would pay more, but the government has reduced that to 30. So it's now 30% for both. So that is the concept of residence. Do we have any question? Any question? Okay, so those are the things I listed to be covered today. And by God's grace, we've done that. So our next topic on Sunday, I think beginning from 2 o'clock, I'll begin from taxation of employment income. I'll give you a list of things that I'll cover in that session of 2 hours. I'll introduce employment, like definition, what is employment, and then when you receive income, then cash benefits and non-cash benefits. I list for you what are the cash benefits, how do we treat them for tax purposes, then the non-cash benefits, and then we'll be looking at small illustrations. For example, if you're given a car, how do you tax a car? If you're given a house, how do you tax a house? Like that. So when you finish, then we do a whole past paper question on employment income. So that's what we do on Sunday, but for today, we stop there. Any question? Any question? Okay, please enjoy the rest of the evening. I hope you've been able to reshare the notes for purposes of our brothers and sisters who joined today, so that they can also read the soft copy notes which I've already given. But I told you, when I begin like employment income, the rates I'll give you will be different from the ones in the soft copy notes, simply because the notes have not been reviewed for some time. But now, if you pay attention to the rates I'll be giving you, the background information will just be fine. It's only the rates you're going to use, the current rates. So asanteni sana. Please enjoy the rest of your evening. See you on Sunday, 2 o'clock. Thank you very much.